Can't you take on more? But no, cried out, my friends. The angel's got the key and you can't get it in. I know it rain, you know it rain. Rain too long, all night long. Rain all day, rain all night. Rain, 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 rain. Rain, 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 rain. Rain, children. Rain, oh yes. Didn't it, yes. Didn't it, you know it did, didn't it? Oh my Lord, how it rains!
The following is special programming from WBRN Radio and on the Boston Red Network. 2019 on May the 22nd, 2019. Boston Red here in the Jerry Pippin Memorial broadcast booth. Our programming, a programming note, I should say, will have the Monday morning quarterback at the same time on Monday morning and an open source report early this week. We've already completed Numbers Man. That is our macroeconomics program. You can find it on Stitcher, Spreaker, iHeart, Twitter, YouTube, all the usual places that you find us, or you can go on Alexa and just say Numbers Man. That will take care of that. The same with the week that was and a Friday Jobber, or the open source report. The same will go there. This is an unusual Memorial Day, I suppose. The way we are treating it editorially is a little bit unusual. We started out with Sister Rosetta Thorpe, a guitarist, a woman who many say that was an inspiration to Elvis Presley, the whole line of rockabilly types at the time. Jerry Lee Lewis was in that sphere. Their influence, they would go to African American churches on a Sunday, sit in the back and learn how to play music properly. That was one of the things, the contribution, and it would appear that this is the way that the progression is in terms of we look at music as knowledge work. We usually don't, but there is a sea of knowledge out there. And Rosetta Thorpe pioneered that with her Fender guitar, and she had an elegant voice on top of that, and she could play piano. She learned it in the church, what they termed the sanctified church. One of the reasons we're also featuring her. And her mother traveled as an evangelist. They left the cotton fields of Arkansas, migrated to Chicago as part of what was termed the Great Migration, and on to New York and Philadelphia. Her music was very, very popular in the 20s and in the 30s, and in the 40s she was distributed by the Army on, at that time, 75 LPs. That's how they did it. And she had a major record contract. What we were able to do was find some programming from the BBC. It was on YouTube. It's a 4-part series, but BBC in 2004-2005 did a bio on the life of Sister Rosetta Thorpe. It was very well done, and we're using it under the Commons license that the BBC has, Creative Commons license. We like to get productions there, so we decided not to use one of the normal starting songs that we use about Decoration Day, whether it be John Lee Hooker or Howling Wolf or whomever. We decided to use her, and we will go out with her in the interview form, where she is actually playing in Manchester at a rail yard. The band is on one side, Sister Rosetta Thorpe is on The Other Side, she's brought in a carriage. And her last concert was in Copenhagen in Denmark in 1970. She died, I believe, in 1971 of diabetes. And diabetes in 1971 is not what it is today. But that started her downward spiral. And finally she was a victim of stroke just before recording a session. We also saw in the Washington Post today a note of the passing of the legendary quarterback Bert Starr. He was with the Green Bay Packers. He was also a coach there. He was 85 years old, and he had been in, as they call, poor health for the last few years. Evidently he'd suffered a stroke, part of getting old in a modern-day America. So what we're attempting to do here today is present a series of stories, a mosaic that is befitting a Memorial Day. And we'll go to a little bit of the history of Memorial Day, and we'll even throw in for free the Statue of Liberty, which was founded basically on for the abolition of slaves. Not you're tired, you're hungry, as they would present it to you in the history books. It was founded before European immigrants were arriving in the U.S. in great numbers, a totally different type of situation there. And many, many times we have... This is also from the Washington Post. The Statue of Liberty was created to celebrate free slaves, not immigrants. A new museum recounts Lady Liberty was inspired by the end of the Civil War and emancipation to collect the collection to immigration connection. Came later in the ball game. The Statue of Liberty in the New York Harbor boasts a number of treasures. The original torch, which was replaced in 1980, and on oxidized not green copper replica of Lady Liberty's face, and recordings of immigrants describing the sighting of the 305-foot statue. It also reveals an aspect of the statue's long-forgotten history. Liberty was originally designed to celebrate the end of slavery, not the arrival of immigrants at Ellis Island. The inspection station, through which millions of immigrants passed, did not open until 6 years after the statue was unveiled. That was in 1886, the year my grandfather was born. Anyway, the placard with the most... famous Emma Lazarus poem, "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddling masses yearning to breathe free," wasn't added until 1903. One of the first messages of the statue had to do with abolition, but its meaning didn't stick. That is from Edward Brinson, a history professor at New York University, and he was offered the book "The Statue of Liberty: A Transatlantic Story." There was an interview with the Post there. The monument draws 4.5 million visitors a year. Was first imagined by a man named Eduardo de Labinet. In France, he was an expert on the American Constitution. At the close of the Civil War, the president of a committee that raised and distributed funds to newly freed slaves. That is according also to Yahya Khan, author of a book, The Enlightening the World, The Creation of Statue of Liberty. Labinet loved America, often giving speeches described by the New York Times correspondent. That was in 1867 as a Feast of Liberty, which moved above the souls of men to the deepest depths. To their deepest depths. He loved it even more when slavery was abolished in June of 1865, Lavernier organized a meeting of French abolitionists at his summer home in Marseille. Lavernier secured the partnership of the sculptor Frederic Augustus Bafali, who took his sweet time in developing an idea. An earlier model, circa 1870, showed Lady Liberty with her right hand in the position we are familiar with, raised and illuminating the world with a touch. But in her left hand she held broken shackles, a homage to the end of slavery. One theory has it that her face, being adopted from a statue of Bartholdi, had prompted the Suez Canal. Had proposed, for the Suez Canal, meaning her vintage could resemble that of an Egyptian woman. The Times reported she was based out of the Roman goddess of Liberus, who typically wore the type of cap worn by free Roman slaves. Eurocentric historians always try to relate things to Rome because they have no place else to go, but we'll go with the Egyptian story. In the final model, Lady Liberty holds a tablet inscribed with Roman numerals of 4 July 1776. The broken chains are still there, though beneath her feet, but they are not all that visible. That's Branson said. Bartholdi made a number of trips to the U.S. to whip up support for his colossal structure. That's according to the National Park Service. And sailing in New York Harbor, he spotted the perfect location. Breedlove's Island, then occupied by a crumbling wooden Fort Wood, fundraisers in both France and the U.S. took a while, according to NPS. Bartholdi cast the project in the boldest terms possible to widen the net of potential donors. He understood marketing, no doubt about that. Bartholdi finished building the statue in Paris in 1884. 2 years later, he oversaw its reconstruction in New York. So it came from France. Liberty Enlightening the World was unveiled on October the 28th, 1886. But didn't involve a big sheet. Instead, they were fireworks, a military parade. Bartholdi climbed to the top, pulling a French flag from his face. By then, the original meaning of the abolition of slavery had pretty much gotten lost. That is from the historian Berenson, saying going unmentioned in the newspaper coverage. In fact, African newspapers rallied against its meaningless hypocrisy. By 1886, Reconstruction had been crushed by the Supreme Court and rolled back its civil rights and protection, and Jim Crow laws were tightening their grip for African Americans. In the book, Benterson quoted in 1886 an editorial in an African paper, the Cleveland Gazette, shoved the Bartholdi statue, torch, and all into the ocean until liberty of this country as such, to make it possible for the industrious and inoffensive colored man in the South to earn a respectable living for himself and his family. The idea of liberty in this country and the enlightening of the world, and even of Pythagoras, is ridiculous in the extreme. F.W. Du Bois also mentioned in his autobiography, we encourage people to read that, recalling seeing the statue on arriving back in the U.S. in 1894 after 2 years in Europe. I know not what multitudes of emotion surged in others, but I had to recall Mr. Little French girl's eyes twinkled as she said, "Oh yes, the Statue of Liberty, with its back to America and its face to France." Yeah. There were immigrants on the ship that Du Bois, but he didn't talk to them. The ship was segregated, in other words. Instead of being in the back of the bus, he was in the back of the ship, so to speak. This is from the People's World, a real history. Memorial Day was born in struggle against the Klan. It's on the 24th of May 2019 by Art Shields. Art Shields was a reporter for the Daily Worker, the Daily World, and the People's World. We must not forget Memorial Day, which we celebrate on Monday, belongs to the foes of racism. The day people place flowers on the graves of fallen veterans was followed by the enemies of the KKK, Ku Klux Klan. Memorial Day belongs to democratic tradition of the American people. It sprung out of war against the hooded terrorists of the South who sought to reestablish slavery on American soil. American right-wingers and false patriots try to hide the real story of the birth of Memorial Day in 1868. At the time, General John A. Logan, the father of Memorial Day, was in the thicket of the fight against the Klan when he issued the first call on the 30th of May for the celebration. Logan was the head of a Grant's Army of the Republic, the first Civil War veteran association. He was one of the outstanding heroes of that 4-year struggle. Logan's fight. Logan was a citizen soldier, enlisting as a private in the Michigan Regiment. He fought the first great battle of Bull Run, that was in 1861, which rich families like the Rockefellers, Morgans, Carnegies were buying substitutes to bleed instead. Logan was wounded at Fort Donelson. By 62, he was a major general. By 63, he was marching through Georgia as the head of a division of anti-slave troops. Victory won. Slave owners slashed. Logan and his troops came home in triumph, and then an assassination's bullet lay President Abraham Lincoln low, and the small-minded Vice President Andrew Johnson became a president. Logan returned to Congress, from which the war had taken him, to make sure that slave owners would not slip back into power. Denounced by slave masters, they began to slip back in with the help of Johnson, who sabotaged the fight against the rising Klan. Logan believed in showing no mercy to rebellious slave owners who organized mobs to whip and lynch black and white Republicans, then the anti-slavery party. In the South, his speeches were filled of bitter denunciation of slave masters. Following the lead of Thaddeus Stevens, the great anti-slavery Republican from Pennsylvania, Logan was soon in a clash with President Johnson. The fight for power between the president and Congress came to a head when Johnson fired his War Secretary Stanton, who was directing the military to fight against the Klan. The first Memorial Day, Stevens and Logan and their fellow progressives almost had Johnson fired in the impeachment trial that followed. Just one senator voted to save the little man's job in the spring of 1868. While the fight was underway, General Logan saw the minds of masses of American people must be awakened to the idea for which the Civil War against slavery was fought. Advocate of the impeachment trial against Johnson, he helped work out the idea of Memorial Day to honor the heroes of the bloody battles of Bull Run, Shiloh, Gettysburg, and hundreds of other theaters of war. All over the North, on May the 30th, 1868, Americans marched to the graves of the veterans dead, throwing flowers and singing the battle hymn of the Republic, John Brown's body. What it meant. War orphan children were the center of celebration at Arlington Cemetery. That's near Washington. Memorial Day helped serve the political purposes of progressives in Congress. It helped then generate a mass support for the fight to reconstruct the South's political life on a democratic basis. It helped postpone for a few years at least the return of a Southern oligarchy. They're back now. And the overthrow of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. For years to come, Memorial Day speeches expressed some of the purest ideas of American democracy at the annual celebrations. People like Oliver Wendell Holmes, not yet a justice on the Supreme Court, voiced their opposition to slavery, and men like Logan warned against the suppression of liberty in the South. Radicals of the North, at a Memorial Day celebration in 1882, Colonel Robert C. Ingersoll, a great veteran of the Civil War, said of American liberty, today we reinvently think of the abolitionists. The abolitionists each have produced no gender, men, and nor noble women. The radicals of the South say no union without slavery. The radicals of the North reply no union without liberty. And that's how liberty was used in those days. The Northern radicals were right upon the great issues of free homes for free men. A president was elected by the free states. The South appealed to the sword and raised the standard of revolt, and for the first time in history, the oppressor rebelled. The first shot liberated the North. Constitution, statutes, and decisions, compromise platforms, resolutions made pass, and ratification of interests of slavery became a mere legal lie. Millions instead resolved that freedom should not perish and that slavery not lived. Millions of our brothers, our fathers, our husbands answered to the nation's call, referred to the flag planted on the soldier's grave. Colonel Ebersol said, "This flag means free hands, free government, and universal education." That was in the 1800s. It means, he says, that Americans have the right to change their government when they want. The right-wing extremists and fascists of today would suppress Memorial Day's ideas, but we will answer them. This Memorial Day we pledge ourselves anew to freedom. The traditions of our revolutionary history are on our side in the fight against fascism, and Memorial Day is our day. This is an excerpted version of the first article appearing in the Daily Worker. That was in May the 29th of 1930, under the line of Memorial Day belongs to the foes of fascism. Now, this was Art Shields. Art Shields was 1888 to 1988. I remember Art Shields was the Daily World's greatest labor reporter. I got to know Art and his wife Esther, herself a labor journalist, soon after I joined the staff at the Worker in January of 1967. Art helped me hone my writing skills. He was a role model in his loyalty to workers and their struggle. A tall, lean, striking, handsome man. He was quiet spoken, modest to a fault, and he was a supreme storyteller. That's Tim Wheeler. Tim Wheeler worked at the Daily World, the Worker, and the People's World for a very long time. He hailed from Seattle in the state of Washington. I think it's fitting and appropriate. We have Art Shields' article here, and it was updated here. And I'll have to get the original article and bring it out, but this was Art Shields. Art Shields was amazing. He died, let's see, he was, how old was Art Shields? Art Shields lived a very, very long time. He's 100 years old, from 1888 to 1988. So he had lived a century, thus he had seen many things happen over time, no doubt about that. I think let me just check on our time here. We don't have any sporting stories now. The Bay Area, we'll, I guess, take a little look at the Bay Area. The number of billionaires worldwide declined by 4.5% to 2,604 individuals. This is a report here. Said everything from Brexit to global tensions are to blame. Here are more interesting facts related to billionaires in San Francisco. San Francisco has the third largest number of billionaires with 75. New York comes in number one with 105. And in Hong Kong, surprisingly, 87. In the past decade, San Francisco has seen a huge jump in its billionaire population, but 2018 was less impressive. The city added just one billionaire to the total from 2017 to 2018. This is a report here. San Francisco will be clear leader when it comes to billionaire density. New York, Dubai, and Hong Kong follow second and fourth in place. The report doesn't specifically mention billionaires, but the survey from Forbes did reveal that the four Bay Area billionaires made the top 50. That's old Ellison from Oracle, Google's co-founder Larry Page, and Sergey Brin. It has 49.8 billion, Page 50 billion, and old Ellison $65 billion there. And this was from the Frisco Gate, part of it moving here as we look at density, homeless report. I think we'll do a special report. This is from the Washington Post here. Berkeley loves its sanctuary city label, but housing crisis is testing its liberal values. What this article talks about is a number of RVs parked in the city of Berkeley. The eccentric Northern California enclave was a sanctuary long before the designation became a must that has a merit badge from the left-leaning city. Berkeley politicians proclaimed the place of refuge for Navy sailors resisting deployment to Vietnam. It was over a half-century ago. It was the birth of a movement to protect the outcast and, in some cases, the outlaw. But the California housing crisis is testing whether Berkeley can remain that kind of place. Faced with sharp criticism from changing population, this is happening in a number of cities, not just Berkeley, California, and Oakland. City leaders have banned people from living in recreational vehicles called RVs, providing that the events the most, even the most acceptable city, is not immune to demands that often accompany wealth and gentrification. Businesses and residents have complained about RVs blighting the city. The mayor there, Jesse, has referred to the March, referring to the March council meeting, the ordinance we passed. I will admit we rushed into, but we are facing a lot of pressure from business and residents. The key there is business and residents, and a lot of people find them in a catch-22. Tom Valito, 66 and homeless, who worked for decades breaking down ships along the docks of the East Bay. He now lives in a decrepit camper on 8th Street in Berkeley. I'll have to ask Tennessee Williams about that neighborhood. In the Gilman neighborhood, a one-time warehouse district, and that is in many, many cities, now has wine tasting rooms. Whole Foods has come in. Many homeless people in California live without a shelter. Nearly half of the nation's unsheltered homeless are in California. It increasingly reflects a bewildering fact, given the resources already devoted to the issue, misdevoted. California is undoubtedly getting worse. Preliminary numbers released last week from San Francisco, Alameda County, which includes Oakland and Berkeley, show a significant increase in the homeless population during the past 2 years. In Berkeley, it was up 43%. Estimates place the homeless population of the Bay Area region encompassing more than 100 cities at more than 30,000, the size of a moderate city in itself. Building affordable housing in California is a growing political challenge as property values skyrocket. That is one of the problems of modern day capitalism. The pressure we are facing as local politicians is telling us that as people spend more and more on housing, they feel more and more aggrieved by so-called blight. That's from Kate Harrison. She is a city council type in San Francisco. In fact, London Breed, she's the mayor of San Francisco, was shouted down in a recent forum about her proposal to open a navigation center. Those have opened around the nation alongside the Embarcadero. I remember the Embarcadero was there for a baseball game and they had an earthquake. No doubt Lisa Patino remembers it also, since she was born in San Francisco. The center would be a temporary shelter for the homeless where people are guided towards health services and permanent housing. GoFund campaigns have emerged in wealthy neighborhoods to finance lawsuits, not to finance homeless, against affordable housing. Two state business groups and anti-tax organization recently filed suit to overturn Proposition C, very important in California, a measure city voters passed last year to impose a tax on large businesses to raise an estimated $300 million a year for homeless initiatives. Mark Benoff, he's the head of Salesforce. I've heard him speak before. A vocal supporter of the tax, donated $30 million to University of California at San Francisco this month to study the causes of homelessness. The problem here is the cities and the states do not need to study the cause of homelessness. They simply need to devote us funds to avert homelessness. A very simple proposition there. You find space, you build SROs, or the single occupancy rooms or whatever, and you move people that are on the streets that wish to into those facilities. That's a very simple situation. It can be modular homes, it could be various types of homes, or housing, but it can be done, and in this age, be done inexpensively. Doesn't cost that much to build one of these types of communities and provide water and etc. To them, and even wire them with internet service, so then people would have a facility, we'll call it, learn skills, programming, what have you, on the internet, use Wikipedia, sort of a sustained knowledge cluster, we'll call it that. Those are the things that cities need to be about. What happens is large amounts, disproportionately large amounts, are spent either on studies or administration, so-called outreach to the homeless. The homeless are not fools. They know what aid is, and there have been crackpot schemes by people like the present mayor of Gavin of California to not give the homeless cash benefits, but to give them subsidies for other things. Now this is an attack on the homeless, and at the same time putting dividers on park benches to discourage the homeless. Why is this being done? Because they simply want to preserve the city for the rich, period, or those that one would assume to be rich, the middle class, a gentrified area. What that means is a flat that normally would be $300 or $400 a month all of a sudden rises to $2,500 a month. It is an exorbitant sum. Can this go on in the type of economy, industrialized economy in 2019? The answer is no. There are a number of things happening out here, and if you tune in to Numbers Man this week in economics, we talk about that. We talk about Goldman Sachs and some of the people that are predicting a little over 1% growth in the second quarter. Well, numerous studies inform us that if it's not in the second quarter, it'll be the third, the fourth, or the first of next year. And the reason for that is demographic shifts. Workers are getting older in the U.S., not younger. Productivity has stalled. There is a lack of, quote-unquote, at least the business community claims, skills, and there's no way to replace the skills. What had happened there since Reagan in the 80s? The right wingers deliberately abandoned the public school system. Then they came in with some rip-off idea called charter schools. But America, in the 52 states on this Memorial Day, do not have the personnel. And many of the personnel that they have are not properly trained to do basic functions, basic so-called thinking. And that in itself is a very, very serious matter that they have. And at the same time, immigration, the proper kind of immigration, that is, the H-1B visas, those are only to certain people, but less of those are coming about. And a nation that abandons its education system through the first 8 or 12 grades or whatever it is, abandons learning in period. And then, of course, you abandon your college system. Many state universities are underfunded, so what happens there? Students have to pick up more and more of the costs. The burdens are upon them. I talked to a man the other day that his son had just finished a university, and then he had to go to a technical college to pick up an architectural type degree to ensure that he would get a job. Well, when you hear out there that there are plenty of jobs, there are jobs out there, but many of the jobs out there are not full-time. They are paid less than $15 an hour and less than 40 hours a week. So this is no spectacular jobs bizarre as the present administration would have people to think. And because of trade, imports, exports, farmers are being damaged that grow basic crops like soybeans. So what does the administration do? They subsidize farmers in an amount greater than Pell Grants. Now, Pell Grants are the future. Soybeans lie in containers. These are grain containers, not containers we use in programming, but it's the same principle. The program is in a container like the soybeans or the corn. But this situation, you create an artificiality, and this has been, Republicans have been ranting and raving about farm subsidies forever. The whole idea behind the farm subsidies, not the scheme that they have now, was to keep the price of basic staples low for American citizens, therefore taking those off the market or setting aside acres or hectares of land that was not put in production to keep the prices down to serve the citizens. This does not serve the citizens at all. This so-called farm thing, what is it, 14 billion, whatever billion it is to take care of the farmers. In other words, it's as Republicans would say, winners and losers. But in this case, they're picking losers. And what happens in these so-called market showdowns, this is with China. China is buying soybeans, or were. They'll find other markets. There are other nations that grow soybeans, grow corn, grow etc. So now they have moved to the high-tech sector with Howie. Howie is a giant communications manufacturer. They manufacture network equipment, have some of the best in the world, and are the best in the world for the new mobile standard called 5G. And they are in emerging markets across the 52 nations on the African continent. They are there. They're in the Americas. They're all over the place. And so what do the U.S. capitalists do? They decide to ban them. Well, they couldn't hurt them doing that, so then they decided to force some of the equipment suppliers, like Qualcomm in the U.S., Micron, the memory people. Now they have even switched to some of the processor makers in London. One of those have decided that they will remove their processors from access to Howie. Well, Howie understands any high-tech company would, that they're developing their own processors. And this was a big argument. We can remember this. It's been around for a long time. That Intel argued that, well, China shouldn't build their own processors because they could use Intel. Well, that was under a different arrangement. Now comes the time they'll have to build their own processors, because processors from some of these other countries will not be accessible to them. So thus they could lose 25% of their revenue. But this is only a temporary situation. This is back once again in the today-like planning that the U.S. has had. Countries like Japan, where old DJ Trump was watching a sumo wrestling match, they gave him a 60-pound trophy. Moron of the day, no doubt. But they plan 20 and 40 years ahead. The socialist countries under V.I. Lenin and later under Chairman Stalin instituted the 5-year plan for cities, states, etc. So it's planning ahead. This immediate planning, is it just immediate planning? In other words, you have a tax cut today and you affect your economy. Yes, you will affect your economy. You'll create more jobs, but it's a temporary situation. Will you have some leftovers? Yes. But then it becomes very tenuous because your whole economy is changing. Increasingly, you're having robots, that is, and also at the same time, algorithms. You have the packing robots at Amazon is now displacing workers that used to pack that before product. Before it's over, Amazon will have those, all of their so-called fulfillment centers that are not perhaps too small. And of course, over the years, the costs will go down. They can have them in a back room. So this is one of the structural changes that's happening to jobs. Uber, Lyft have literally already ordered 100,000 self-driving cars to be delivered at a date in the future. So what they are planning to do is replace their so-called gig drivers with autonomous or self-driving cars. The same has happened with there are some semis moving across the west, taking the mail from the U.S. Postal Service. So you're going to see more and more of this, and this is why these old catch-all schemes, like what happened in the EU elections, for these right-wing parties. Notice Le Pen got one more seat than Macron in France, and his right of center party. That doesn't mean anything. Those opportunistic moves will, in other words, barring immigrants, will save some jobs now. But in the future, many of those jobs will disappear, as they have before in the 1900s, to automation, the farm situation. Everybody moved off the farm, including his sister Rosanna Thorpe, to urban cities. That was the situation we had. And then we had what was it called? Back in the think about it a minute here. Back in the 80s, we had destruction of the inner cities, inner cities, downtown, called urban renewal. Now you have gentrification, that destruction, and warehouses like what happened in Berkeley that were left over are now being developed into Whole Foods, etc., and whatever else. So, in other words, a changing time. You go from urban renewal, which we used to call African removal, to gentrification, which we call middle class deposits, to say the least. Why is this happening? Cities have figured out that they can build upward, literally, and have a greater tax base. Eventually the city's populations will shrink, but that doesn't really matter, because the people that they have now in 2019 will pay more in taxes, spend more, so they'll have a little ecosystem there, a little peaky trough, so to speak, as one of my colleagues, Mr. Kelly, used to say. So the swine will be all at the trough, but the situation is, how long will they be able to eat from this trough? And that is where a tenuous economy is there. We're not saying, and none of the people are projecting, that the Big Depression will hit today or tomorrow, but it could. A lot of the data now is pointing back to 2009. If you remember, in the 2008 campaign, Barack Obama out of Illinois was running for President of the United States, first African American to do that on a major party ticket. And John McCain, the late John McCain, suspended his campaign to go to Washington with the Grand Deal. He fell apart, and Barack Obama never looked back. He was riding Mr. Lincoln's train from Philadelphia to Washington, D.C. to get inaugurated as number 44. And he saved the country from a depression with the program, very limited programs, that the bosses at the time in the Congress and the lobbyists allowed them to put forth. And the right-wingers raised all kinds of hell about TARP. Actually, TARP was under G.W. Bush. And about subsequent quote-unquote bailouts. Well, the bailouts were for the banks. Why were they for the banks? Because the financial system at the time was so interwoven in the American economy that they could not cut it out like a cancer. It is a cancer, but they couldn't cut it out without having to reshuffle the economy. They knew that. In other words, what they were seeing is what the British were seeing. They were placing industries under what they call administration. In other words, they were nationalizing them, right and left. They would have to do it here. So they had an escape plan. But then they wrote legislation to say, well, we're not going to do that anymore. We'll have an orderly way of a corporate bankruptcy to wind down these weak type operations and continue on. You can do that, but you can't do that when you have the Payless shoe stores of the world, the Toys R Us, etc., all going belly up, and thousands of workers lose their jobs. Like what happened with Sears, with old, what was his name? Anyway, he was a roommate of the Treasury Secretary. What is his name? I always mess his name up. Lamper is the person at Sears, He had his own little fund there, hedge fund. So they effectively cannibalized Sears. He even bought the real estate and rented it back to Sears. And those are some of the things that's happening under the so-called populism scheme that you have. What Art Shields is writing about, what they were talking about when they established the Statue of Liberty, is still today. Slavery was the key. Once slavery was abolished, and then post-slavery they brought back Jim Crow, it didn't only affect African Americans, it affected the wider population. And you're starting to see more and more of that. And then you had a war, the Second World War, the veterans that we honor at their gravesites. And then you had these little wars like Vietnam, and not much of them. They did generate some graves, but the whole point that with the war, that was a stimulus program that brought people to Berkeley, to Oakland. Bobby Seale's family moved there, and many others, to work in war-related industries and stayed there. In California, after the war in the 50s, had a universal college education, a community college that didn't cost anything. So many of these progressive programs people took advantage of. The GI Bill educated the greatest generation, so to speak. Many of those, because it was a male-centric economy, so people, men primarily, and some women, had an opportunity to go to a university, trade schools, etc., get houses, but of course African Americans were redlined out of it. But those were things that gave this quote-unquote Make America Great Again operation a start in life. And that went through the 60s and through the some of the 70s, and then the buzzsaw came in. Then people reacted to it and brought in Ronald Reagan, who almost caused more than one depression on his own. It really had an effect on the economy in this nation, on the whole structure. Until Bill Clinton arrived there with a measly program, but it was still a pro-business program. But he was able to usher in the dot-com boom. So thus more flowers were put on graves. The florist industry was not in the shape that it is now. Of course, now you have the internet, and that has affected everything, including the buying of flowers. Of course, many of those flowers come from Chile. So those are some of the things we're looking at on this day. And Memorial Day, Decoration Day, is now about liberty. He's not just about remembering the fallen. Of course, it went from fallen soldiers to just fallen citizens. Many people out honoring their ancestors today, putting flowers on those that have graves anymore. Some places they can't have those, but whatever, maybe they're shining up the urns. So this is our presentation on the 26th of May 2019, the Boston Red, the Jerry Piffin broadcast booth. Have a good and Memorial Day weekend. We'll see you on the Monday Morning Quarterback. We'll be talking about the Stanley Cup. There's an article, there's many articles. There's one on ESPN we're going to use, and there was one in the Washington Post, why the Bruins can't win the Stanley Cup. That'd be very interesting. The St. Louis Blues is the other team out there. The Bucks of Milwaukee, that's Kareem Abdul-Jabbar's old team, came up short. The Raptors are in the rafters, and they are on their way, as one would say. And we're approaching June, as we normally do. The NBA will start their final go-round, and so is the NHL. We also have the women's softball series. I guess they call it World Series. And we'll be reporting on that. Women sports. We'll look at some of the latest polls that we have and talk about a little bit about electability. And I'm not certain what we'll do with the talk shows. We'll see. We usually do that on Monday Morning Quarterback, but of late we have been substituting other things there.
In the summer of 1964, Rosetta was booked by Granada Television to perform in a folk, blues and gospel special. The musicians were American, the audience English students, the venue a disused railway station, Chorlton-cum-Hardy, just outside Manchester.
The Manchester gig was a curiosity in the middle of the tour for us. It was kind of bizarre, but we were all new to England and we were aware of all this interest in blues and gospel. We all thought it was strange, the setup with the audience on one platform and the musicians on the other. And she rose to the occasion. She loved the drama of the situation and trying to bridge that gap between the platforms and sell the whole thing across the track to the audience.
By now, Rosetta was 49 years old, and she had been on the road for more than 40 of those years. But even in cold, wet and windy England, the magic was still there.
The inimitable Sister Rosetta Tharpe.
All the sweet horsey. Oh, this is the wonderfulest time of my life.
And the people are so sweet to stay here. And I come in on let me tell you what I come in on. Oh, yeah! Let me see. You know it did, didn't it? Oh, yes, how it rained. I said it rained, children. Rain, oh, yes, didn't it? Yes, didn't it? You know it did, or didn't it? Oh, my Lord, how it rained. Can't you take on more? But no cried out, my friends. The angel's got the key and you can't get in. I know it rain, you know it rain. Rain too long, all night long. Rain all day, rain all night. Rain, 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 rain. Rain, 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 rain. Rain, children. Rain, oh yes. Didn't it, yes. Didn't it, you know it did or didn't it? Oh my Lord, how it rained!